The 15th of June, 1944. Saipan, Mariana Islands. Major General Yoshitsugu Saito stood in his command bunker as the first wave of American amphibious vehicles churned toward the beaches. Through his field glasses, he counted the landing craft stretching to the horizon, dozens, then hundreds, then more than he could process. Behind them, transport ships disgorged still more. The invasion force that morning deployed over 600 landing craft of various types to put 30,000 Marines ashore in the first 48 hours. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Saito had been told by Imperial General Headquarters that America possessed perhaps a few hundred such craft across the entire Pacific. The evidence crashing onto his beaches suggested something far more disturbing. The Japanese High Command's understanding of American industrial capacity, specifically regarding amphibious warfare equipment, represented one of the most catastrophic intelligence failures in military history. This miscalculation would shape every battle from Tarawa to Okinawa, contributing to strategic decisions that doomed Japan's Pacific defense. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Japan's approach to amphibious warfare in 1941 reflected centuries of island nation psychology and recent military experience. The Imperial Japanese Navy possessed approximately 170 specialized landing craft at the outbreak of war. This number seemed adequate for operations planners envisioned in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. Japanese military doctrine emphasized quality over quantity, elite infantry units over mass assault, and assumed that superior fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages. The Daihatsu-class landing craft, Japan's primary amphibious vessel, measured 11 meters in length and could carry 70 men or a light tank. First introduced in 1935, it represented solid engineering, reliable diesel engines, steel hull construction, and a bow ramp for rapid unloading. Japanese factories produced approximately 1,100 Daihatsu craft during the entire war, a number that would be revealed as tragically insufficient. The Type II Kami amphibious tank, introduced in 1942, demonstrated Japanese innovation in amphibious warfare technology. Fitted with detachable pontoons fore and aft, it could propel itself through water at 7 kilometers per hour, before shedding its flotation devices to function as a conventional light tank ashore. Only 184 were ever built. Japanese engineers designed it well, but Japanese industry could not produce it in meaningful numbers. The disparity began with raw materials. Japan's entire steel production in 1941 totaled approximately 7 million tons. American steel production that same year exceeded 75 million tons. This 10-to-1 advantage in basic industrial capacity translated directly into military hardware production capabilities. Japanese shipyards in 1942 were distributed across the home islands with major facilities at Kure, Yokosuka, Sasebo, and Maizuru. These yards prioritized capital ships, aircraft carriers, battleships, and cruisers over smaller landing craft. The strategic emphasis reflected Japanese naval doctrine focused on decisive fleet engagements rather than sustained amphibious operations. When American submarines began interdicting Japanese merchant shipping in late 1942, shipyard capacity shifted increasingly toward escort vessels and cargo ships, attempting to maintain supply lines to isolated garrisons. Landing craft production received lower priority, a decision that would prove irreversible. The Japanese Army and Navy maintained separate supply and production systems, an institutional division that hampered coordination throughout the war. Landing craft fell into a bureaucratic gap between services. The Navy controlled most shipbuilding facilities but viewed landing craft as primarily Army equipment. The Army needed landing craft but lacked shipbuilding expertise and facilities. This organizational failure meant neither service developed comprehensive amphibious warfare doctrine or allocated sufficient resources to landing craft production. By contrast, American military planning in 1942 already envisioned amphibious operations as fundamental to Pacific strategy. The Higgins boat, officially designated Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel or LCVP, emerged from Andrew Higgins's New Orleans boatyard. Higgins had designed shallow draft boats for Louisiana oil field operations, vessels that could approach swampy coastlines and retract rapidly. Marine Corps testing in 1938 demonstrated these boats' military potential. By 1941, Higgins Industries had refined the design into a standardized 36-foot landing craft with a protected bow ramp, armored sides, and capacity for 36 men or one vehicle. The LCVP's design prioritized mass production over individual quality. Constructed primarily from plywood rather than steel, powered by simple diesel engines, and featuring minimal complex components, the Higgins boat could be manufactured by workers with basic carpentry skills. This production-friendly design proved critical as American industry scaled up for war. Andrew Higgins's New Orleans facility alone could produce 700 LCVPs per month by mid-1943. Additional production lines operated in Buffalo, Seneca, and Stockton. Total American LCVP production exceeded 23,000 units during the war, a number that would have seemed fantastical to Japanese planners even if they had known. The Landing Craft Mechanized, or LCM, represented the next size category in American amphibious fleet. At 50 feet in length, LCMs could transport one Sherman tank or 60 tons of cargo. Their steel construction required more sophisticated manufacturing than LCVPs, but American shipyards produced over 11,000 LCMs between 1942 and 1945. Japanese intelligence estimated total American landing craft production at perhaps 500 units through early 1944. The actual number already exceeded 30,000 by that date. The landing ship tank, designated LST, embodied American mass production philosophy applied to large-scale amphibious warfare. At 328 feet long and displacing over 4,000 tons when loaded, LSTs could carry 18 Sherman tanks or 27 loaded trucks or 400 tons of cargo directly onto beaches. Their shallow draft of 3 feet forward when unloaded allowed them to beach on most Pacific shorelines. British planners initially conceived LSTs, but American industry perfected and mass-produced them. Kaiser shipyards and other facilities delivered over 1,000 LSTs during the war. Each LST could transport more cargo in one voyage than 50 Daihatsu craft. The implications for sustained amphibious operations were profound. Japanese military intelligence offices in Tokyo received scattered reports of American landing craft numbers throughout 1943, but systematically discounted them as impossible. Cultural assumptions about industrial production shaped this disbelief. Japanese manufacturing emphasized craftsmanship, individual quality, and small batch production. The notion that Americans could produce hundreds or thousands of standardized vessels simultaneously contradicted Japanese understanding of shipbuilding as a precision craft, requiring years of training and careful attention to each vessel. Intelligence analysts concluded that reported American landing craft numbers must represent total Allied production, including British and Canadian vessels, or perhaps included non-military boats repurposed for training. The Battle of Tarawa in November 1943 provided the first clear evidence of American amphibious capability. The 2nd Marine Division assault employed 125 LVTs, landing vehicles tracked, specialized amphibious tractors that could crawl over coral reefs, plus dozens of LCVPs and LCMs. Japanese defenders on Betio Island fought ferociously, inflicting over 3,000 American casualties, but the sustained wave after wave of landing craft delivering fresh troops, ammunition, and supplies ultimately overwhelmed the 4,800-man garrison. Admiral Keiji Shibasaki's confident prediction that Americans could not take Tarawa in 100 years crumbled in 76 hours, not primarily due to American tactical superiority, but due to logistical dominance enabled by overwhelming numbers of landing craft. Japanese observers analyzing Tarawa focused on tactical lessons about beach defenses, bunker construction, and defensive positioning. Strategic implications of American landing craft abundance received less attention. This analytical failure reflected institutional bias toward tactical solutions. Japanese military culture emphasized fighting spirit, tactical excellence, and individual unit performance. Strategic-level industrial analysis was viewed as less important than battlefield valor. Post-battle reports noted American material superiority, but concluded that improved defensive tactics could still achieve victory despite enemy advantages. The Marshall Islands campaign in January and February 1944 demonstrated escalating American amphibious capability. Operations against Kwajalein and Eniwetok employed over 400 landing craft of various types. The 5th Amphibious Force, under Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, had perfected coordination between naval gunfire, air support, and successive waves of landing craft. Japanese garrisons on Kwajalein and Eniwetok fought to near-total annihilation, but American casualties remained relatively light due to overwhelming firepower delivered by the amphibious fleet. Each successive operation revealed American capability to sustain multi-division assaults across vast ocean distances, something Japanese planning had considered impossible given their understanding of American industrial capacity. By spring 1944, Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo faced mounting evidence that required fundamental strategic reassessment. Reports from surviving officers across the Central Pacific consistently described American landing craft in numbers that seemed to defy reason. The May 1944 intelligence summary compiled for senior Army and Navy leadership included this assessment. American amphibious forces appear capable of landing division-strength formations on hostile beaches, with losses acceptable to them. The enemy possesses landing craft in quantities that exceed our previous estimates. This careful bureaucratic language concealed a terrifying reality. Japan's entire defensive strategy presumed American amphibious capabilities were limited by landing craft availability. If that assumption was false, Japan's scattered island garrisons could not hold. Lieutenant General Hideki Tojo, serving as both Prime Minister and War Minister, received detailed briefings on American amphibious operations in early 1944. Tojo had risen through army ranks with service in Manchuria and understood ground combat but had limited appreciation for industrial warfare's strategic implications. When staff officers presented revised estimates of American landing craft numbers potentially exceeding 1,000 units, Tojo reportedly questioned whether intelligence analysts were creating excuses for battlefield failures. The notion that Americans could build landing craft faster than Japan could construct defensive positions contradicted his fundamental understanding of warfare. Tojo's response shaped official policy. Rather than acknowledge overwhelming American industrial advantage, headquarters directed field commanders to fight more tenaciously, construct stronger defenses, and maintain faith in ultimate victory through superior spirit. The Saipan invasion, in June 1944, forced Japanese leadership to confront reality. Over 800 landing craft supported the operation, delivering 71,000 troops across 15 miles of invasion beaches in the first 48 hours. General Saito's reports described an amphibious fleet that seemed without limit. Each defensive position destroyed was followed by fresh American troops delivered by more landing craft. Japanese counterattacks, even when successful in tactical terms, could not offset the continuous flow of American reinforcements. The 30,000-man Japanese garrison fought for 3 weeks before being annihilated. American control of Saipan provided air bases within B-29 bombing range of the Japanese home islands, fundamentally altering the strategic situation. The battle's outcome hinged not on courage or tactical skill. Both sides possessed those qualities in abundance, but on America's ability to deliver and sustain overwhelming force through amphibious operations. The American industrial system that produced this amphibious fleet operated on principles foreign to Japanese manufacturing. Henry Kaiser's shipyards in Richmond, California, employed assembly line production methods adapted from automobile manufacturing. Rather than building ships sequentially from keel to completion, Kaiser's yards constructed prefabricated sections simultaneously at multiple locations, then assembled them rapidly using welding rather than traditional riveting. This modular construction reduced LST building time from 8 months to 2 months. By 1944, Kaiser's 7 shipyards employed over 90,000 workers operating 3 shifts daily. One facility alone launched an LST every 5 days on average. Higgins Industries in New Orleans expanded from 750 employees in 1940 to 20,000 employees by 1943. The workforce included substantial numbers of women, an employment pattern necessitated by male military service, but enabled by simplified production processes. Training programs converted workers with no shipbuilding experience into productive employees within weeks. This labor flexibility, impossible in Japan's traditional craft-based system, allowed American industry to scale production geometrically rather than arithmetically. Japanese shipyards faced chronic skilled labor shortages throughout the war. Training new workers required years in traditional apprentice systems. When experienced workers were drafted into military service, production capacity dropped proportionally. American industry's ability to rapidly train unskilled workers and maintain or increase production despite military recruitment represented a systemic advantage. Japanese planners failed to anticipate. The geographic distribution of American landing craft production provided redundancy against any single point of failure. Manufacturing facilities operated on both coasts and in interior waterways. This dispersion meant submarine attacks, the primary Japanese capability for disrupting American production, could not significantly impact overall output. By contrast, Japan's concentrated shipbuilding centers were vulnerable to American submarine interdiction of raw materials, and, by late 1944, to air attack. American production benefited from secure supply lines. Iron ore from Minnesota, steel from Pittsburgh, engines from Detroit, all moved safely across American rail networks to coastal shipyards. Japanese industry depended on raw materials imported from Southeast Asia and China. American submarines sank over 1,000 Japanese merchant vessels during the war, progressively strangling industrial production. By 1944, Japan's landing craft production had fallen below 100 units annually, not due to design failures or industrial incompetence, but because basic materials could not reach factories. The strategic implications crystallized during planning for the Philippines campaign in autumn 1944. General Douglas MacArthur's return to Leyte required an amphibious fleet of staggering proportions. 738 vessels supported the initial landings, including 157 LSTs, 79 LSMs, landing ships medium, and over 300 LCVPs and LCMs. This fleet delivered 132,000 troops and 500,000 tons of supplies in the first month. Japanese commanders defending the Philippines had at their disposal fewer than 100 landing craft of all types for potential counterattacks or reinforcement operations. The disparity meant American forces could reposition divisions by sea faster than Japanese forces could march similar units overland. Amphibious mobility had become strategic mobility, and Japan possessed no counter. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who conceived the kamikaze special attack strategy in October 1944, understood that conventional naval warfare could not overcome American material superiority. His desperate proposal to use suicide attacks reflected clear-eyed assessment that Japan lacked sufficient conventional forces to contest American amphibious operations. Kamikazes might sink individual landing craft or transport ships, but could not stop the vast fleet delivering American forces across the Pacific. Onishi's strategy, born of mathematical reality rather than fanaticism, sought to inflict sufficient American casualties to force negotiated settlement. The underlying premise remained that America's industrial advantage could not be matched, only its will to continue might be broken. Japanese attempts to expand landing craft production in late 1944 encountered insurmountable obstacles. The Navy Ministry's emergency program called for producing 300 Daihatsu craft by June 1945. This target, ambitious by Japanese standards, represented 1 month's production from Higgins Industries alone. Requisite steel allocations could not be met. Shipyard capacity was absorbed by warship repairs, submarine construction, and escort vessel production. Raw material shortages forced substitution of wood for steel in some landing craft, reducing load capacity and durability. The program delivered fewer than 80 craft by war's end, insufficient even for local defensive operations. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The fundamental disparity appears in comparative production statistics. Between December 1941 and August 1945, the United States produced approximately 88,000 landing craft of all types. This total includes 23,358 LCVPs, 8,661 LCMs, 1,511 LCIs landing craft infantry, 1,051 LSTs, and tens of thousands of specialized amphibious vehicles. Japan produced approximately 2,300 landing craft total during the same period, approximately 1 for every 38 American craft. This 38-to-1 production ratio exceeded even the 10-to-1 advantage in basic steel production, demonstrating American success in prioritizing and scaling specific military hardware categories. The disparity extended beyond numbers to operational capability. American landing craft benefited from superior engines, reliable radios for coordination, and standardized repair parts. Japanese craft, while individually well-built, lacked interchangeable components. Each boat's engine required custom maintenance. Radio equipment was scarce and unreliable. American amphibious forces could sustain operations indefinitely through logistical support fleets. Japanese landing craft operations were limited to short-range missions due to fuel shortages and maintenance difficulties. These operational differences meant American landing craft could be used repeatedly across multiple campaigns, while Japanese craft were effectively single-use assets given maintenance and fuel constraints. American development of specialized amphibious vehicles further widened the gap. The DUKW, an amphibious truck that could transition directly from ship to shore to inland transport, had no Japanese equivalent. Over 21,000 DUKWs were produced, providing seamless logistics from offshore supply ships to frontline positions. The LVT Landing Vehicle Tracked series, developed from pre-war rescue vehicle designs, could cross coral reefs and continue inland. 18,000 LVTs of various types were built. These specialized vehicles multiplied the effectiveness of conventional landing craft by maintaining logistics momentum after initial beachhead establishment. Japanese intelligence officers attempting to understand American amphibious capability faced institutional barriers to accurate assessment. The intelligence apparatus was divided between Army and Navy services that rarely shared information systematically. Each service maintained separate estimates of enemy capabilities, often contradictory. Army intelligence focused on ground force, strength, and tactical capabilities. Navy intelligence emphasized fleet movements and naval aviation. Neither developed comprehensive industrial intelligence capacity to track American production across multiple sectors. The institutional structure that had served Japan adequately in previous conflicts against China and Russia proved inadequate for total war against an industrial superpower. Colonel Makoto Matsutani, assigned to Imperial General Headquarters Intelligence Section in 1943, later described the psychological difficulty Japanese officers faced accepting American production figures. In post-war interviews preserved in the National Diet Library, Matsutani explained that Japanese military culture equated quantity with inferior quality. The assumption that mass-produced equipment must be shoddily constructed was deeply embedded. When reports indicated Americans were producing landing craft by the thousands, Japanese analysts concluded these must be temporary vessels, perhaps even disposable boats intended for single-use operations. The concept that standardized mass production could maintain high quality contradicted Japanese manufacturing philosophy so fundamentally that evidence was reinterpreted to fit existing beliefs rather than beliefs being revised to match evidence. The Battle of Peleliu in September 1944 demonstrated American amphibious warfare's evolution beyond simple beach assaults. The 1st Marine Division's landing employed not just conventional craft, but integrated naval gunfire, air support, and specialized vehicles in coordinated waves. Over 800 vessels supported an assault force of 28,000 troops against a garrison of 11,000 Japanese defenders. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa's defensive strategy fighting from fortified positions inland rather than at the beaches, inflicted severe American casualties. Nearly 10,000 American casualties over 2 months proved this was no easy victory. However, the sustained logistics enabled by abundant landing craft allowed Americans to continue offensive operations despite heavy losses. Japanese defenders eventually were annihilated, not through tactical defeat but through logistical exhaustion. American landing craft delivered fresh troops, ammunition, water, and medical supplies continuously. Japanese forces received nothing. The outcome was inevitable. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, who became Combined Fleet Commander in May 1944, understood naval mathematics clearly. In staff conferences during autumn 1944, Toyoda acknowledged that Japan could not match American production in any category of naval vessel. His strategy focused on husbanding remaining fleet units for decisive battle rather than contesting every American amphibious operation. This strategic retreat from peripheral areas reflected acceptance that Japan lacked means to supply or reinforce isolated garrisons facing American amphibious assault. The decision to abandon thousands of Japanese troops on bypassed islands was not callous indifference but mathematical necessity. Landing craft to evacuate or reinforce these garrisons simply did not exist. The Kaiten manned torpedo program, initiated in late 1944, represented another desperate response to American amphibious superiority. These submarine-launched suicide torpedoes targeted transport ships and landing craft in anchorages. Between February and August 1945, Kaiten operations sank approximately 6 ships. This minimal impact, achieved at cost of over 80 trained submarine crew members, demonstrated that even suicide weapons could not meaningfully reduce the American amphibious fleet. Production replaced losses faster than Kaiten could sink vessels. The program continued until war's end, not because it was effective, but because no alternative existed. Japanese defensive preparations for homeland invasion in 1945 focused extensively on beach defense against amphibious assault. Operation Ketsugo, the Homeland Defense Plan, positioned over 10,000 aircraft for kamikaze missions against invasion fleets. Over 3 million regular troops and 28 million civilian militia were organized for coastal defense, beach obstacles, underwater mines, and prepared defensive positions lined probable landing sites. These preparations reflected Japanese understanding that American invasion would come by sea, delivered by the vast amphibious fleet that had conquered the Pacific island by island. Japanese planning assumed American forces would employ thousands of landing craft in initial assault waves. This assumption was correct. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, allocated over 3,000 landing craft for initial assault phases, with thousands more for logistics support. The scale of Operation Downfall's planned amphibious operations exceeded anything previously attempted. Operation Olympic, the invasion of Kyushu scheduled for November 1945, would have landed 14 divisions in the first phase. Operation Coronet, the subsequent invasion of Honshu's Kanto Plain planned for March 1946, would have been even larger. The landing craft requirements for these operations exceeded the total number of such vessels Japan had built during the entire war, for both assaults combined. American industrial capacity had created amphibious warfare capability at a scale that transformed strategic possibilities. Japan's home islands, previously considered impregnable to invasion due to geographic isolation, now faced credible threat of direct assault. Japanese attempts to develop countermeasures to American amphibious operations produced limited results. Suicide boats, small craft loaded with explosives and manned by single operators, were produced in thousands by mid-1945. These Shinyo boats, built of wood and powered by simple automobile engines, represented Japan's response to overwhelming American amphibious capability. The suicide boat strategy relied on numerical advantage achieved through simplified construction, the same mass production philosophy that had given America landing craft superiority. However, Japan's industrial capacity could not match American scale even in simple boat construction. Approximately 6,000 Shinyo boats were completed by August 1945. This represented impressive production given material shortages and bombing damage to factories, but remained inadequate against an invasion fleet of thousands of landing craft, supported by hundreds of warships. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 and Soviet entry into the war rendered Operation Downfall unnecessary. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. The massive amphibious fleet assembled for invasion operations was never used against the Japanese home islands. However, landing craft played crucial roles in occupation operations. Over 400,000 American troops landed in Japan during August and September 1945, delivered by the same amphibious vessels that had conquered the Pacific. The occupation proceeded peacefully, but American ability to land overwhelming force rapidly anywhere in the Japanese archipelago ensured compliance. Japanese military officers involved in surrender and occupation witnessed American amphibious capability firsthand. Ports at Yokosuka, Sasebo, and other locations filled with American landing craft of types and quantities Japanese commanders had never imagined possible. Former Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, prior to his death on Saipan in July 1944, had reportedly told staff officers that defeating America required destroying their will to fight, as their industrial capacity was beyond Japanese ability to match. This assessment, proven tragically accurate, reflected reality that many Japanese leaders had understood but could not publicly acknowledge during the war. Post-war analysis by Japanese military historians focused extensively on the industrial disparity that had doomed Japan's war effort. The Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted by American forces after occupation, included Japanese experts who provided detailed assessments of Japan's industrial limitations. These reports documented how raw material shortages, particularly in steel and petroleum, had constrained every aspect of military production, including landing craft. Japan's peak annual steel production of 7.8 million tons in 1943 barely exceeded 2 months of American steel production during the same period. This fundamental resource gap made industrial warfare unsustainable, regardless of tactical excellence or fighting spirit. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey's Pacific War section, published in 1946, included comparative production tables that starkly illustrated the disparity. In landing craft production, the United States built 38 times more vessels than Japan. In merchant shipping, the ratio was 4-1 despite Japan's desperate need for cargo vessels. In aircraft production, the ratio reached 2-1 by 1944 and 3-1 by 1945. These production advantages translated into sustained combat power that Japan could not match. Every battle became a war of attrition that America could win through replacement and reinforcement, while Japan's losses were irreplaceable. Japanese naval officers' post-war writings frequently addressed the landing craft disparity as emblematic of broader failure to understand American industrial warfare. Admiral Tomioka Sadatoshi, who served in the Naval General Staff, wrote in his 1951 memoir that Japanese planners had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern war. The assumption that superior fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages, while inspirational, proved strategically catastrophic. Tomioka argued that Japanese leadership should have recognized industrial capacity as the decisive factor in 20th century warfare and either avoided conflict with America or negotiated settlement before industrial disparities became overwhelming. His analysis, published during American occupation, represented unusual candor about Japanese strategic failures. The landing craft disparity influenced post-war Japanese defense policy. The Japan Self-Defense Forces, established under American occupation authority, initially possessed minimal amphibious capability. Japan's island geography would seem to require amphibious forces, but post-war constitutional restrictions and American security guarantees made large-scale amphibious operations unlikely. Japan focused instead on defensive capabilities and naval forces oriented toward coastal defense. Not until the late 20th century did Japan begin developing meaningful amphibious capabilities through its ground self-defense forces' Western Army operations. American landing craft technology influenced post-war amphibious warfare globally. The basic Higgins boat design remained in service through the Korean War and influenced landing craft development in numerous nations. The LST design was adopted by multiple navies worldwide and remained in active service into the 21st century. The principles of mass-produced, standardized amphibious vessels established during World War II shaped military logistics for subsequent decades. The concept that industrial capacity could create decisive military advantages became embedded in American defense strategy and influenced Cold War military planning. The industrial disparity between American and Japanese landing craft production reflected broader patterns in the Pacific War. In every major category of military hardware, aircraft, warships, tanks, artillery, trucks, American production exceeded Japanese capacity by factors of 3 to 1 or greater. The landing craft disparity of 38 to 1 represented an extreme case, but was consistent with overall industrial advantages that made American victory inevitable once full industrial mobilization occurred. Japanese strategic planning in 1941 had relied on the assumption that quick victories in the war's early phases would force American acceptance of Japanese dominance in Asia before American industry could be fully mobilized. This strategy failed because American industrial capacity exceeded even optimistic Japanese estimates, and because American political will to continue the war remained strong despite early setbacks. The role of women in American landing craft production deserves particular emphasis. By 1943, women constituted approximately 30% of workers at Higgins Industries and similar percentages at other shipyards. These workers, many with no prior industrial experience, learned welding, riveting, and assembly skills rapidly. The famous Rosie the Riveter propaganda imagery reflected real industrial transformation that allowed American production to expand, despite millions of men being drafted into military service. Japan's industrial labor force remained predominantly male throughout the war, with women's factory work limited to lighter manufacturing. This gender-based labor constraint reduced Japan's potential industrial capacity by failing to mobilize half the population for war production. The technological sophistication of American landing craft also exceeded Japanese vessels in ways not immediately apparent from specifications. American landing craft featured reliable marine diesel engines produced by manufacturers like General Motors and Gray Marine. These engines were mass-produced to standardized specifications, allowing easy repair and replacement. Japanese landing craft engines were individually crafted with limited interchangeability of parts. When an American landing craft engine failed, replacement engines were readily available from supply vessels. When a Japanese engine failed, the craft was often permanently disabled. These seemingly minor engineering differences had major operational implications over sustained campaigns. Radio communication equipment in American landing craft enabled coordination impossible for Japanese amphibious operations. Each American landing craft could receive orders and report conditions via radio to control vessels offshore. Japanese landing craft relied on visual signals and pre-arranged plans, with minimal ability to adjust to changing conditions. During complex operations involving hundreds of landing craft, this communication advantage allowed Americans to redirect waves to less defended beaches, concentrate forces at breakthrough points, and respond to unexpected defensive positions. Japanese amphibious doctrine, based on limited numbers of craft and minimal communication capability, could not adapt to American methods. The training of American landing craft crews also reflected industrial warfare principles. Standardized training programs at bases like Fort Pierce, Florida, and Camp Edwards, Massachusetts, produced crews with uniform capabilities. Training emphasized teamwork, mechanical reliability, and following procedures rather than individual heroism. Crews trained on the same standardized vessels they would operate in combat, ensuring familiarity with equipment. Japanese landing craft crews received more traditional military training, emphasizing courage and determination, but less emphasis on mechanical proficiency and standardized procedures. When mechanical problems arose, American crews could often perform field repairs, while Japanese crews might lack technical knowledge or spare parts. The logistical support structure behind American landing craft operations multiplied their effectiveness. Repair ships, tender vessels equipped with machine shops and spare parts, accompanied amphibious fleets and could repair damaged landing craft rapidly. Fuel tankers ensured constant resupply. Ammunition ships maintained continuous supply to forces ashore. This floating logistics infrastructure, itself, requiring hundreds of specialized vessels, enabled sustained amphibious operations across vast Pacific distances. Japan lacked comparable logistics capability. Landing craft operations were limited to short-range missions from established bases because logistics vessels to support extended operations did not exist. The island-hopping strategy that characterized the American Pacific Campaign was fundamentally enabled by landing craft abundance. Each operation, whether Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, or Okinawa, required hundreds of landing craft to transport troops and supplies from ships to shore. The ability to conduct simultaneous operations in multiple locations, MacArthur advancing through New Guinea and the Philippines, while Nimitz's forces advanced through the Central Pacific, required duplicating entire amphibious fleets. American industrial capacity made this possible. Japan's limited landing craft numbers forced sequential operations and prevented concentration of forces at decisive points. The human cost of landing craft disparity appears clearly in casualty figures. Japanese garrisons on bypassed islands, unable to be evacuated or reinforced due to lack of amphibious transport, slowly starved or died from disease. Rabaul's garrison of over 90,000 troops was effectively abandoned after February 1944, neutralized by air attack but never invaded. These troops survived until war's end but contributed nothing to Japan's defense because landing craft to evacuate or redeploy them did not exist. Conservative estimates suggest over 100,000 Japanese troops died on bypassed islands from starvation and disease, casualties attributable indirectly to landing craft shortages that prevented evacuation. The Battle of Okinawa, April through June 1945, demonstrated the ultimate evolution of American amphibious warfare. Operation Iceberg employed over 1,300 vessels, including more than 400 landing craft of various types, to put 180,000 troops ashore on an island that could be resupplied by sea continuously throughout the campaign. The 32nd Army defending Okinawa, comprising over 100,000 troops, fought from prepared positions and inflicted over 65,000 American casualties, including approximately 14,000 killed. Despite this costly victory, American forces never faced material shortages. Landing craft delivered supplies continuously. Japanese forces were progressively isolated and destroyed through firepower and attrition. The outcome illustrated landing craft's strategic role, not just transporting troops to beaches but sustaining operations indefinitely through sea logistics. Japanese casualties on Okinawa exceeded 110,000 killed, with approximately 7,400 captured. Civilian casualties exceeded 100,000, many killed in crossfire or by Japanese forces who viewed surrender as dishonor. The battle's ferocity reflected Japanese understanding that Okinawa's fall would enable direct invasion of the home islands. The sustained American logistics that enabled victory despite desperate Japanese resistance relied fundamentally on the vast amphibious fleet that delivered everything from tanks to medical supplies directly to frontline units. Japanese defenders could observe American landing craft arriving continuously offshore, an endless procession of vessels demonstrating industrial capacity beyond anything Japanese military planning had anticipated. The psychological impact on Japanese commanders witnessing American amphibious operations cannot be precisely measured but appears in numerous post-war accounts. Officers who survived battles from Tarawa to Okinawa consistently described a sense of hopelessness when facing continuous waves of American reinforcements delivered by landing craft. Tactical victories, destroying an American position or repelling an assault, proved temporary because fresh troops and supplies arrived within hours. This psychological dimension of industrial superiority, the demoralizing effect of facing apparently limitless enemy resources, contributed to erosion of Japanese defensive effectiveness over time, even among elite units. The alternative history question, whether more landing craft would have significantly improved Japan's strategic position, invites analysis. Additional landing craft might have enabled Japan to reinforce threatened positions or evacuate isolated garrisons. However, the fundamental constraints would remain. Japan lacked fuel to operate large landing craft fleets. Merchant shipping losses meant supplies to deliver to garrisons were scarce. American submarine and air superiority would have interdicted landing craft operations. The landing craft disparity was symptomatic of broader industrial and logistical disadvantages that no single production category could remedy. Japan's strategic situation by 1944 was effectively hopeless regardless of landing craft numbers, because American advantages extended across all dimensions of modern warfare. The role of landing craft in post-war historical memory differs notably between America and Japan. In America, landing craft became iconic symbols of victory, immortalized in photographs like those from Normandy or Iwo Jima, showing troops wading from ramp-bow vessels. The Higgins boat was celebrated as one of the war-winning weapons. Eisenhower reportedly called it the most important piece of equipment in World War II. In Japan, landing craft scarcity receives less historical attention, overshadowed by narratives emphasizing fighting spirit and tactical prowess. The industrial dimensions of defeat, while acknowledged by military historians, feature less prominently in popular memory focused on sacrifice and suffering. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans, located at the original Higgins Industries site, preserves landing craft and documents their production. Visitors can examine actual LCVP hulls and learn about manufacturing processes. The museum's exhibits emphasize landing craft's role in Allied victory across both European and Pacific theaters. By contrast, Japanese museums like the Yushukan at Yasukuni Shrine or the Peace Memorial Museums in Hiroshima and Nagasaki focus on combat experiences and civilian suffering rather than industrial production comparisons. This difference in historical presentation reflects distinct national narratives about the war: American emphasis on industrial achievement versus Japanese emphasis on endurance and sacrifice. Academic historians have analyzed the landing craft disparity extensively. Michael Sturmer's work on the South Pacific War examines how American logistical superiority shaped campaign outcomes. John Dower's War Without Mercy discusses how racial attitudes influenced both American and Japanese strategic thinking, including Japanese assumptions about American industrial capacity being incompatible with military effectiveness. Richard Frank's Downfall details how landing craft abundance would have enabled the planned invasion of Japan, making clear that Japanese strategic planning in mid-1945 correctly identified amphibious assault as the primary threat. The development of helicopter assault in post-war warfare partially superseded landing craft for certain operations. During the Vietnam War, American forces pioneered air mobility doctrine, using helicopters to deliver troops to inland positions without requiring beach assaults. However, landing craft remained essential for heavy equipment, transport, and major amphibious operations. The Persian Gulf War in 1991 and subsequent conflicts demonstrated that amphibious capability, based on descendants of World War II landing craft designs, continued providing strategic options for power projection. Modern, amphibious assault ships operate hovercraft and helicopters alongside updated versions of traditional landing craft, demonstrating enduring relevance of amphibious warfare concepts established during World War II. Japan's post-war development of amphibious capability proceeded slowly, due to constitutional restrictions limiting military forces to self-defense roles. The Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force operates several landing ship tank vessels obtained from America in the 1950s and domestically produced successors, but in numbers far smaller than major amphibious forces. Not until 2012 did Japan establish a dedicated amphibious rapid deployment brigade comparable to U.S. Marine Corps units. This delayed development reflects both constitutional constraints and strategic calculation that American forces would provide amphibious capability within the alliance framework. The historical memory of landing craft disparity may also influence Japanese reluctance to invest heavily in amphibious forces associated with offensive operations. The story of landing craft production disparity illuminates how industrial capacity shapes military outcomes in modern warfare. Tactics, training, and fighting spirit matter, as Japanese forces demonstrated repeatedly through determined defensive stands. However, when industrial capacity disparities reach orders of magnitude, tactical excellence cannot compensate. The 38-to-1 production advantage in landing craft reflected American systematic approach to war mobilization, recruiting workers regardless of gender or prior experience, simplifying designs for mass production, standardizing components for easy repair, distributing production across multiple facilities for redundancy, and maintaining secure supply lines enabling continuous operation. Japan, constrained by traditional manufacturing culture, limited workforce mobilization, vulnerable supply lines, and competing priorities for scarce resources, could not match this industrial warfare model. The generals who realized America had built 2,000 landing craft, while Japan struggled to build 200, faced not merely a tactical problem but a strategic impossibility. Each statistic revealed during the war, landing craft, aircraft, ships, trucks, pointed to the same conclusion. Industrial capacity had become the decisive factor in modern war, and Japan could not compete. The landing craft disparity was particularly devastating because it directly enabled American strategic mobility. Control of the sea meant little without vessels to transport forces ashore. America's amphibious fleet transformed ocean distances from barriers into highways, allowing rapid concentration of force anywhere in the Pacific. Japan's island empire, seemingly defensible through geographic dispersion, became a vulnerability when Americans could assault any location with overwhelming force delivered by inexhaustible landing craft fleets. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.